At 3:26 a.m. Zulu time, a satellite surveillance operator working at the classified Cheyenne Mountain Monitoring Station, located inside a mountain in Colorado, detected a thermal anomaly in Sector 7 of the restricted airspace over the remote Rocky Mountains region. This anomaly was located approximately 340 kilometers northwest of Nellis Air Force Base. Sergeant Marcus Thompson, with 14 years of experience observing infrared radiation patterns and electromagnetic emissions in spectra accessible only to high-ranking military personnel, detected a 0.7 degree Celsius variation in an area that officially did not appear on any public documents. It was a training area restricted to military use, according to civilian maps. However, it housed something far more confidential. He had been at his workstation for 16 hours, drinking coffee that had gone cold more than 3 hours ago. He was looking at high-definition liquid crystal displays showing information gathered by ultra-top-secret spy satellites orbiting at an altitude of 450 km, capable of detecting thermal variations of less than 1/10 of a degree. The anomaly that Thompson discovered was faint, almost undetectable to anyone without his specialized training. However, to his trained eyes, it stood out like a beacon in the dark. It was a pattern of dispersed heat, distributed across a grid invisible to conventional systems, rising from the subsurface in sync with low-frequency emissions that perfectly matched known patterns of U.S. underground military bases. Thompson took a deep breath, feeling that familiar sensation in his abdomen that always arose whenever he made a truly significant discovery. He immediately initiated the confirmation protocol, beginning a cross-evaluation with data from other satellite surveillance stations. This was done by combining information from state-of-the-art infrared detection systems with spectral analyzers that could distinguish between natural and artificial heat sources with 99.4% accuracy. The data confirmed their suspicions. The secret base that supposedly didn't exist. The Spectro facility, built in secret over more than a decade with funds diverted from classified budget line items, was producing a thermal signature that surveillance systems detected despite being believed undetectable. This base, located 2,100 meters beneath the rocky surface, was established to conduct research into new air defense technologies, directed energy microwave weapon prototypes, and experimental radar systems that, in theory, could neutralize any known aerial threat. However, at 4:47 a.m. Zulu time, that base, which was supposed to be undetectable, was detected. Thompson, to prevent his discovery from being intercepted, immediately sent it by secure means to the main defensive intelligence office at the Pentagon, using communication codes that changed every 30 seconds. The message he received was simple, but deeply concerning. Thermal anomaly confirmed in Sector 7. Coordinates ordered. Signature consistent with the underground facility, alert level raised to maximum. The response was obtained in less than 2 minutes. A strategic analysis team was urgently activated in the Secretary of Defense's office, prompting intelligence analysts sleeping in underground rest quarters, designed precisely for circumstances like this, to wake up. General William Rothschild, the head of strategic operations, was informed while putting on his uniform. He was receiving a briefing as he made his way to his operations center through the Pentagon's underground corridors. Rothschild, with 32 years of military service and first-hand experience in 7 regional conflicts, immediately understood how serious it was. An ultra-secret base had been discovered by enemy surveillance. It is likely that the thermal signature analysis indicated that the emissions came from high-capacity cooling systems, precisely the type of technology a foreign power would employ to keep advanced research laboratories operating in extreme underground conditions. Rothschild gave the order for Protocol Spectrum, a contingency plan created 7 years ago for this particular circumstance, to begin without delay. The protocol included various alternatives, each more violent than the last. The initial option was to increase security at the Spectro facility by reinforcing air defenses at the Donkey and activating modern electronic jamming systems. The second alternative was to carry out a controlled demolition operation, selecting and eliminating the most critical assets within the base to prevent sensitive technology from falling into enemy hands. The third alternative, the most radical, consisted of completely eliminating the facilities and permanently disabling all of their operational capabilities. After a 15-minute in-depth analysis, Rothschild decided that the second alternative would be chosen. However, this would only occur once enemy intelligence had definitively confirmed the base's compromise. Additionally, he ordered the preparation of a squadron of B-2 Spirit bombers for a contingency bombing mission, but it would not be carried out unless further information was received about a foreign power's access to data related to the Spectrum facility. The B-2s, also known as the stealth bomber or the Spirit, were the most advanced aerial warfare technology ever produced by any nation in modern military history. The cost of each aircraft, including all support systems, maintenance, crew, and training over a 30-year operational lifespan, was approximately $1,000 in 2025 adjusted dollars. The B-2 is 21.03 meter long and has a wingspan of 52.43 meter, giving it a smaller visual profile than many commercial airliners. However, its payload capacity was comparable to that of World War II bombers, which were 5 times larger. Its design was based on innovative aerodynamic geometry, with precisely calculated curves and angles to scatter radar signals, allowing them to return to the emitter undetected. This made it difficult for conventional radars, or even some more advanced ones, to acquire and maintain track of the target. The B-2's radar cross-section was roughly the same as that of a marble floating in the air, whereas the radar cross-section of earlier bombers, such as the B-1 Lancer or the older B-52 Stratofortress, spanned several square meters. The B-2 used advanced composite materials, such as titanium alloys and carbon fiber, to achieve this level of radar stealth. Additionally, it employed special coatings known as radar-absorbent paint, which dispersed electromagnetic waves instead of reflecting them. Furthermore, its fuselage had no flat surfaces or sharp angles that could coherently reflect radar waves. Everything was slightly curved to scatter any radar reflections in all directions simultaneously, so that no significant amount of energy would return to the transmitting radar. The B-2 reached a maximum speed of around Mach 0.95 at cruising altitude, which translates to about 760 km/h in the stratosphere. However, it could fly much slower on low-altitude missions. Its unrefueled range was approximately 11,700 kilometers, meaning it could take off from bases on US territory and strike targets almost anywhere in the world without the need for aerial refueling. However, it typically flew with refueling to optimize its weapons load. Its service ceiling was approximately 15,140 meters, allowing it to reach an altitude higher than most known air defense systems. The B-2's arsenal was highly sophisticated. In its internal bays, it could carry up to 22,180 kilos of ordnance, including conventional gravity bombs, GPS-guided precision munitions, and cruise missiles. Although never publicly confirmed, it also had the theoretical capability to carry various nuclear warheads. The weaponry chosen for the mission, authorized by Rothschild, would be specifically designed to penetrate deep underground structures. The bombs used would be known as GBU-43, Massive Ordnance Air Blast, also generally referred to as fuel-air bombs. If they were modified for deep penetration, they would be adapted versions with advanced guidance systems that enabled the B-2 to deliver ordnance with an accuracy of less than 3 meters, even under zero visibility conditions. Aircraft number 86CO-129, known as Spirit of the Arcs, and with an operational life of 16 years and nearly 8,400 accumulated flight hours, was chosen for this particular mission. The crew consisted of 2 experienced officers, Colonel James Morrison, who piloted the aircraft and had spent 19 years in strategic bombing operations with over 2,100 hours flying the B-2, and Major Sarah Chen, who was in charge of the weapons systems and had 14 years of specialized experience in precision missions in active combat scenarios. At 5:30 a.m., an urgent call from Operations Command woke Morrison at his home near Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri. He was ordered to report to the base immediately for a top priority mission. Special classification. Access required. After 30 minutes, Morrison arrived at the base's classified conference room and received a briefing detailing exactly what was expected of him. He was provided with detailed information about the location of the Spectrum facility, its known architecture, its defense systems, and, most importantly, the reasons to believe it had been breached. In addition, satellite images of the site were shown to him. He was informed that over the past 24 hours, intelligence had observed unusual communication patterns between Russian classified security officials and unidentified individuals within US territory. The communication models employed historical codes linked to the transfer of strategic intelligence. Likewise, over the past semester, surveillance satellites had identified 4 unauthorized incursions by surveillance drones into US airspace, specifically in the general area where the Spectrum facility was located. Although none of the drones were apprehended before fleeing, their flight patterns indicated that they were conducting electromagnetic data collection and photographic reconnaissance. Morrison analyzed all this information, taking the consequences into account. If the Spectro facility had been compromised, any research on next-generation air defense systems being conducted there could potentially fall into the hands of a strategic adversary. This posed a threat not only to US national security, but also potentially to global security. The decision to besiege the base with a B-2 was one that went beyond the usual tactical considerations. It was a decision with profound political impact and possibly significant international repercussions as well. However, Morrison knew that his job was not to question those political decisions, but simply to carry out the military orders he had been given effectively and professionally. At 6:15 a.m., he received his flight instructions, taking off from Whiteman at 8:30 a.m. Central Time. The flight began at an altitude of 7,600 meters and gradually climbed to 12,200 meters. A flight path that avoided airspace with known commercial traffic, approached the Spectrum facility from the northeast, flying at low altitude for the final 50 kilometers of the approach to avoid detection by conventional air surveillance systems. Weapon launch at 10:47 a.m. Central Time, synchronized with the coverage intervals provided by the electronic jamming systems. These systems would be activated simultaneously from nearby ground-based electronic warfare platforms. Return to base shortly after launch, following an evasive route to evade any air defense systems that might be activated in response to the attack. At the same time that Morrison was contacted, Chen was also contacted. She was instructed to notify the base within 2 hours for the specific preparation of the armament. As a weapons systems officer, she would be responsible for adjusting the armament precisely to specifications, checking all electrical connections between the weapons guidance systems and the B-2's navigation systems, and ensuring that all operational and safety redundancies were properly in place. Chen arrived at the base at 7:45 a.m. and was immediately taken to the armament area, an underground facility where the B-2 assigned to the mission was being prepared. The armament to be installed consisted of 16 GBU-43 massive ordnance air blast bombs, each weighing nearly 11,000 kilos, which meant using the aircraft's entire internal payload capacity. These projectiles, although often referred to as conventional bombs, were actually extremely advanced weapon systems. Each one contained approximately 8,500 kilo of thermobaric explosives, a specialized combination that produced a wide-area explosion and was more effective against deep structures and hardened targets than conventional standard fragmentation bombs. Thermobaric explosives operated in 2 stages. In the first stage, an initial explosion dispersed a cloud of finely pulverized fuel over a wide area. The second stage involved igniting the cloud after a delay, which triggered a secondary explosion far more violent than the first. This model made thermobaric bombs especially effective against underground targets, as they produced shockwaves that propagated through the ground and rock, causing severe structural damage. The vacuum effect generated by the thermobaric explosion could also fatally harm people and structures, even at distances where the direct blast pressure was relatively low. The 16 projectiles to be installed on the B-2 for this particular mission would have integrated GPS guidance systems, enabling them to be launched from a safe altitude without requiring the B-2 to approach the target closely enough to be detected by the most modern air defense systems. The expected accuracy of these systems was less than 3 meters under ideal conditions, and between 5 and 10 millimeters in most real-world operational situations. Chen checked every power supply line, every component, and every connection over the next 3 hours. The work was boring and required total concentration. A mission failure could be caused by a simple error, such as a misaligned connector or an incorrect software load. However, an error could even cause the ordnance to fail to detonate properly, or even worse, to detonate accidentally inside the B-2 during flight or launch. This would lead to the destruction of the aircraft and the death of Morrison, and possibly of other individuals on the ground. Chen finished his final check at 11 a.m. Everything was correct. The B-2 was ready for takeoff. Morrison received notification that the aircraft was ready for the pre-flight. He drove across the base to the maintenance hangar, where the Spirit of the Ark awaited. The bomber looked exactly as he remembered it, a dark triangle emerging from the gloom, its smooth, angular lines designed to displace the air rather than collide with it. The technicians were carrying out the final checks, following checklists with mechanical precision. Morrison was driving slowly around the plane, conducting his own external inspection. He was looking for anything anomalous, any difference that might indicate potential problems. He checked the control surfaces. He confirmed that the ailerons, rudder, and elevators moved smoothly throughout their full range of motion. He verified that there were no fluid leaks beneath any of the fuselage access panels. He checked the engine air intakes to ensure there was no damage. Morrison entered the aircraft through the entry hatch once he was sure everything was in order. The B-2 had an incredibly narrow cockpit that had been designed as an ergonomic, cocoon-like space. In order to reduce the radar signature and weight, Morrison slid into his pilot's seat, which was a special design that distributed G-force pressure during aggressive maneuvers. Chen positioned himself behind and to Morrison's right at his station. The cockpit was equipped with state-of-the-art LCD monitors, which replaced the analog instruments of previous bombers. Everything was information. Everything was data. Morrison carried out the startup procedures methodically, powered up the inertial navigation systems, and ensured they displayed the base's correct coordinates and that navigation would be accurate by combining GPS and inertial navigation systems. He verified that the electronic warfare systems were functioning properly and that the communication systems were encrypted and tuned to the correct frequencies. Everything looked green. Authorization to move the aircraft to the takeoff runway was provided by the base's air traffic control. Morrison released the brakes and the B-2 began to move slowly from the runway to the hangar. While on the runway, Morrison performed the routine engine checks. To verify that each engine responded properly to the controls, he individually throttled up each one. He requested and received permission to take off after being satisfied. The B-2's GE F118 engines roared to life, producing around 103,500 N of combined thrust when he pressed the throttle to full power. The bomber began accelerating down the runway, reaching 215 knots. Morrison gently pulled the control stick toward him, and the B-2 lifted off the runway without a hitch, retracting its landing gear and beginning its ascent into the sky. Morrison guided the bomber back to its original heading, plotting an aerial route that would first take it north of its target, then east, and finally south, with an approach pattern that would not cross any known commercial air corridor. Chen verified that the weapons systems were properly receiving navigation data from the B-2 system. Everything looked nominal. Morrison would maintain level flight at 12,200 minimum for the next 4 hours at a speed of approximately 480 knots. Fuel consumption was predictable and regulated. The B-2 was heading straight for its target. As the hours passed, Morrison began the gradual descent that would bring him to launch altitude. Morrison would drop to 4,600 meters below the radar horizon of most ground-based air defense systems when he was 50 kilometers from the Spectro facility. For the final 40 kilometers of the approach, he would maintain this low altitude, hoping that the B-2 would go undetected due to its extremely low radar signature. When he was 20 kilometers from the target, Morrison would execute a sharp turn that would put him on a course perpendicular to his final approach line. This maneuver was designed to minimize the B-2's radar cross-section so that any radar that might detect its approach would not pick it up. Chen would launch the first batch of ordnance 10 seconds after completing this turn. The first 4 GBU-43s were expected to be released 2 seconds apart, creating a sequence of impacts that was considered more effective at penetrating defenses than a single massive strike. Morrison would execute a sharp 180-degree turn, bringing the B-2 back onto its initial approach line, but traveling in the opposite direction after the first 4 projectiles had been fired. On this second approach, Chen would launch the following: 4 GBU-43s, again with a 2-second interval between each launch. After this second set of launches, Morrison would proceed to the third and fourth approach groups until all 16 GBU-43s had been completely expended. The total time for all the shots would be about 4 minutes. When the last projectiles were launched, Morrison would change the bomber's heading to an escape route that would take it north again, outside the operational area. He would climb back to cruising altitude over Itu and head back toward Whiteman. The entire mission, from takeoff to landing, would take about 8 hours. The weaponry to be launched from the sky was designed with specific features to maximize damage to the Spectre facility without exceeding permissible effects. Each GB-43 would strike the ground at specific coordinates, which have been calculated to establish an impact pattern that would fracture the rock surrounding the underground infrastructure and propagate damaging shockwaves throughout the entire structure. The mission planners had meticulously simulated the anticipated damage using advanced supercomputers. Their analyzers indicated that this wave of 16 GBU-43s could inflict devastating damage on the Spectrum facility, such as the eventual collapse of the main structures, the destruction of research systems in the underground laboratories, and the incineration of nearly all documents and records stored in the classified archives. However, it was expected that the damage would not extend beyond the Spectre facility itself, with minimal impact on the surrounding areas due to its depth and the targeted nature of the attack. The B-2 maintained its course toward the target, its engines roaring, with Chen continuously monitoring navigation data and weapon systems. Morrison was always attentive to his navigation and monitoring tools, as well as to communications. Morrison began making the altitude corrections that would bring him to the correct launch altitude as they approached the initial descent point. The descent was carried out gradually and smoothly, with the aim of maintaining flight profiles that would not produce anomalous radar readings. Morrison began his descent when he was 53 kilometers from his target, taking the B-2 from 2,200 meters to 4,600 meters. The speed remained unchanged at 48 Chan knots for the next 10 minutes. At that moment, the Spectrum facility's air defense systems, which had been operating at maximum alert since the initial thermal anomaly was detected, began picking up the first signals that something was approaching the restricted airspace. The faint reflections in the scan pattern detected by the facility's underground air surveillance radars were difficult to characterize, although they appeared to correspond to a large aircraft. However, these reflections were so faint and marginal that many of the radar operators were not entirely convinced whether what they were seeing was a real contact or simply noise and radar processing artifacts. Colonel Richard Vans, head of the Spectrum facility, was informed about these suspicious contacts. With 27 years of experience in air defense, Vans knew how to distinguish between false alarms and real contacts. Despite being weak, these contacts exhibited characteristics of a genuine contact. He ordered the alert status to be raised to maximum, allowing the facility's air defense systems to be fully powered up, including newer fire control radars and short-range anti-aircraft missile systems. However, enabling these systems also had repercussions. Fully activating these systems meant that the Spectro facility was no longer being masked by passive electronic jamming systems. Any enemy surveillance scanning the area at this moment would be able to identify the facility's radar emissions, confirming its precise location. Vans was faced with a tactical dilemma. Staying silent meant he would probably be caught off guard by any ongoing attack. Making his location public meant that the air defenses, but also the Spectrum facility, would no longer be a secret. Vans chose to disclose the position. He ordered all air defense systems to be fully powered up at 30 Pompos Abdemusi, 5 kilometers from the target. Morrison and Chen received confirmation that their systems were detecting radar emissions from the general area of the Spectrum facility. These emissions indicated that the facility was attempting to acquire and track the B-2. However, even though the facility had revealed its precise location by activating its radars, the fire control system still didn't seem to have achieved a firm lock on the B-2. Morrison lowered his altitude even further, to 3,000 meters, placing the bomber below the radar horizon of the underground air defense systems. Ground-based radar systems generally have a limited horizon, which is the maximum distance at which they can detect a target flying low to the ground. By positioning the B-2 below this horizon, Morrison was placing it in a position that would make it very difficult for air defense systems to acquire an effective track. 20 kilometers from the target, Morrison made a sharp turn that brought him perpendicular to his final approach path. As the pilot applied controlled pressure to the control stick, the B-2 smoothly rotated its ailerons and kept the roll under control. The bomber was at that moment ready to launch. Shen checked that the weapon systems were ready. All indicators were green. The 16 GBU-43s were mounted on their respective launch racks, all with guidance systems activated and ready to be released. Chen began counting down to launch. 10 seconds. 9. 8. Morrison kept the bomber on its approach trajectory, flying straight toward the target. 7. 6. 5.5. Chen activated the launch systems numbered 4, 3, and 2. The initial GBU-43 was released from its launch rack, separating from the B-2's fuselage. Once released, the projectile's small GPS guidance system engines activated, propelling it toward its preset coordinates. The second GBU-43 was released 2 seconds later, then the third, and finally the fourth. Now the first 4 projectiles were in flight, descending through the sky toward the Spectrum facility. Morrison continued on his straight trajectory for 3 more seconds. Then he executed the sharp 180-degree turn that would begin his second approach. The B-2, as it turned, accelerated, and its wings absorbed the G-forces of the maneuver. Chen continued counting 30 seconds after the first 4 projectiles were launched. Chen released the second set of 4 GBU-43s, which were spaced identically. Morrison was already on the route for his third approach. The cycle was repeated twice more. In total, all GBU-43s were released within 45 seconds. The B-2 now carried only its minimum maintenance fuel load, about 25,000 kilos. Morrison would turn the bomber again, but this time he would head north along the escape route. It would climb to its cruising altitude of 2,200 meters and begin heading back to Whiteman. From the first shot to the last, the total duration was exactly 4 minutes. In the skies below, above the Spectre facility, the 16 GBU-43s descending from the sky initiated their detonation sequences. Each projectile was designed to strike at a specific time interval, with the first 4 impacts spaced half a second apart. The first impact occurred at 10:47:30 a.m. Central Time and struck the ground about 150 meters from the main ventilation shaft of the Spectro facility. The thermal explosion was deafening. The energy released was equivalent to 1,500 tons of TNT. The rock around the impact site was instantly pulverized and turned into a very fine powder. It was hurled into the sky in a column of debris that exceeded 300 meters in height. A 45-meter diameter crater was formed in the ground, exposing rock strata that had not been exposed to sunlight for millions of years. Half a second later, the second GBU-43 collided, causing an equally destructive explosion about 200 meters from the first impact site, followed by the third and then the fourth. The first 4 impacts created a pattern of craters around the perimeter of the facility, and each impact generated shock waves that spread through the ground in all directions. The operators and staff at the Spectro facility, located about 2,100 meters underground, began to feel the effects of these attacks. The first signs came in the form of vibrations that ran through the facility's fundamental structures. The seismographs inside the facility, which had been monitored since the thermal anomaly was detected, began to pick up seismic activity, unlike anything they had ever recorded before. The equivalent magnitude of each GBU-43 impact, according to the Richter scale, was approximately 3.2, a significant value, but not catastrophic. However, the cumulative impact of 4 such events occurring one after another and, almost immediately afterward, 4 more began to cause cumulative structural damage. In the laboratories located on the facility's lowest levels, where research on next-generation air defense systems was being conducted, some of the structural frames supporting the main corridor ceilings began to show cracks. The advanced equipment began to vibrate on the support tables. In the facility's command centers, some delicate instruments began falling from their storage locations. Colonel Banz remained firmly in his command seat, monitoring the facility's status panels as they lit up with bright red alerts. His facility was under attack. The pattern of impacts indicated that it was a coordinated strategic attack, probably carried out by a strategic bomber. Banz's uncertainty about what was coming had been resolved. This was a war. Banz immediately initiated the facility's emergency protocols. He ordered all emergency isolation doors to be closed, sealing off the facility's various sectors from one another, which would limit the damage and potentially safeguard the less affected areas from any further impact. Morrison, in parallel with the bomber's attack above, had completed his evasive turn and was beginning to climb back to cruising altitude. He ordered a partial evacuation, especially of the areas that would likely be under direct fire if any overhead structure collapsed. He tried to contact his superiors at the Pentagon. However, he discovered that the communication systems were being jammed by the electronic warfare activities underway. Chen was monitoring the data on the effects that the B-2 surveillance system was recording. All 16 impacts were being recorded, each one demonstrating that the ordnance had detonated exactly at the predefined coordinates. At this moment, the bomber was traveling at about 450 knots, accelerating to reach its cruising altitude. The Spectrum facility's air defense systems, which had been fully powered up prior to the attack, were being overwhelmed by the sheer number and sophistication of the assault they faced. The radars were saturated with cluttered data from airborne debris, radar echoes from the uneven terrain, and the difficulty of tracking a target as elusive as the B-2. None of the air defense missiles at the facility managed to intercept the bomber. Morrison continued his flight north, gradually slowing down after reaching cruising altitude and thus establishing a fuel economy that would allow him to return to Whiteman without having to refuel in mid-air. The real damage from the avalanche of impacts began after him, on the Spectrum device. The structures, which were designed to withstand direct impacts from conventional weapons, but not to endure a barrage of 16 thermobaric bombs, each releasing energy equivalent to 1,700 tons of TNT, began to fail catastrophically in the upper sections of the facility. Most of the mechanical systems that provided environmental support were located there. The damage caused by the shockwaves from the high-velocity impacts was severe. The water pipes supplying the cooling systems broke, causing the hallways to flood. The electrical conduits were torn from their supports, creating the potential for short circuits and cascading power failures. The damage was similar on the intermediate levels, where some laboratories and the command centers were located. Although the reinforced concrete structures that formed the ceilings of those levels were stronger than those above, vibrations and shock waves still caused significant damage. Some small structural frames in the laboratories collapsed, crushing some of the equipment inside. In the deepest layers, which housed the vaults for storing classified files and some primary data processing servers, the damage was less severe in terms of structural collapse, although still significant. The vibrations caused the data storage systems to potentially fail, damaging the information stored on the hard drives. The server cooling systems were shut down, which initiated the overheating process in the electronic circuits. Colonel Banz conducted a damage assessment 1 hour after the last strike. The report was grim. Approximately 65% of the Spectro facility's operational capabilities had been eliminated or were inactive. Of the 68 staff members who were at the facility when the attack occurred, 12 had been confirmed dead, 35 had been injured to varying degrees of severity, and the remainder showed no visible injuries. Colonel Vans, despite having been struck lightly by a falling beam, continued working. He ordered that procedures be initiated to completely evacuate the facility. Under the current conditions, it was not possible to continue operating. The facility would require extensive repairs that could take between 18 months and 2 years. Operational capacity would be severely compromised during that period. The attack had also confirmed that the location of the Spectre facility was known. It was no longer hidden. Continuing operations at the site would be irresponsible. Morrison was piloting the B-2 back to Whiteman, the engines roaring as Chen was strapped into her seat behind him. Both were aware that one of the most important missions ever carried out by a strategic bomber had recently been completed. An assault on the Spectre facility would not only demonstrate the power of US precision bombing technology, but would also send a clear message to any foreign power contemplating jeopardizing a US military research facility. Morrison flew the B-2 on the approach to Whiteman 3 hours later. Morrison gently applied the air brakes and engine reverse to slow down once the main wheels touched down on the runway. Morrison taxied the B-2 to its maintenance hangar as it braked at walking speed. Morrison shut down the engines after the aircraft had come to a complete stop. The 8-hour flight had come to an end. The cabin remained silent for quite some time. Afterward, Chen contacted them from his station. "Good job, pilot." Morrison smiled. "Yes, good job." General Rothschild was notified that the mission had been carried out successfully. Both stated that their work on this specific occasion had contributed to a historic event at the Pentagon. The B-2 had returned undamaged. All 16 impacts had been verified at their respective target coordinates. The Spectrum facility had been severely damaged, but not completely destroyed. Rothall realized that this measure would have significant political repercussions. Although the Spectro facility program had been classified, its destruction would inevitably and eventually be discovered. The questions would be posed as follows. Why was a classified facility attacked? What was destroyed? Was this an error or an intentional act? Rothschild knew that the President and the Secretary of Defense would have to address these issues. However, the mission, known as Operation Black Phantom, had already been completed. A Russian spy satellite orbiting the globe detected an infrared radiation anomaly emanating from the southwestern United States, while Rothschild was pondering somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. What their sensors had detected was confirmed by Russian analysts. A large energy burst had occurred in United States territory. The Russian Ministry of Defense was immediately informed. An emergency meeting of the Security Council was convened in Moscow. The following questions were asked. What caused this explosion? Was this a test of a new weapon? Was it a civil war? Or was it an attack by a foreign power? The effects assessments indicated that it was an attack by a strategic bomber. Russia feared that this was an attack by the United States, possibly aimed at them or their allies. Quickly, Russia began deploying more air defense systems. At first, the Russian commanders ordered that the alert status of all the country's armed forces be raised to the highest level. This included the deployment of strategic reserves, enhanced naval patrols, and more effective aerial surveillance. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. In Washington, the president was informed that Russian bombings had been detected by Russian surveillance at the Spectrum facility and that the country was responding by raising its alert level. The president immediately convened his national security team for an urgent meeting. A classified video conference session was convened for key officials, including the Director of Central Intelligence, the National Security Advisor, and the Secretary of Defense. The president described the situation. Enemy surveillance had identified the Spectro facility as compromised. They had allowed a B-2 precision strike to level the facility and the research it contained. The latter had been successful. However, Russia had noticed the attack and was reacting by raising its alert level. The dilemma the team faced was, should the United States react to Russia's escalation, or should it try to de-escalate the situation? The Secretary of Defense defended the idea of continuing to demonstrate strength. A strong response to Russia's escalation would demonstrate that the United States was committed to protecting its interests. The National Security Advisor defended de-escalation. Direct communication with Moscow, clarifying that the attack was directed against a US domestic target and posed no threat to Russia, could prevent further escalation that might lead to armed conflict. The president listened to both points of view. Then he made a decision. He ordered that the alert be maintained, but that contacts with Russia begin immediately to de-escalate the situation via the red phone, the direct line between the Kremlin and the White House. After 30 minutes, the president was in direct contact with his Russian counterpart, explaining that the detected attack had been an internal US incident and posed no danger to Russia or its allies. Initially skeptical, the Russian president eventually accepted the explanation. He ordered that the Russian alert status be returned to its normal level. The crisis had been averted. Morrison and Chen at Whiteman Air Force Base participated in a debriefing session. During this, intelligence officers asked them a precise set of questions about every detail of the attack and the flight. The B-2 was never identified. It suffered considerable radar interference. The weapon guidance systems operated without any issues. Did any mechanical issue occur with the aircraft? Both answered the questions fully and honestly. The debriefing produced a final report that was classified at the highest level, and access was granted only to those with a need to know. It was decided to completely evacuate the Spectro facility within 1 week. While extensive repairs were carried out, personnel would not be present at the facility. The research being conducted at the facility would take place at another location, one that would be more secret and better guarded than the Spectre facility. The attack on the Spectre facility served as a reminder of how vulnerable they are, even the most confidential ones, to precision strikes. The B-2 Spirit had once again proven why it was considered the world's most sophisticated precision bomber. It could fly thousands of kilometers undetected and deliver weapons with meter-level accuracy. Morrison and Chen continued their careers in the Air Force, with the Black Phantom mission recorded in their personal files as one of the most important operations ever carried out. Morrison would retire as a brigadier general years later, after having made significant contributions to the development of future generations of air strategy. Chen would continue on active duty and eventually become the first woman to serve as head of strategic air weapons systems. The Spectrum facility was eventually repaired, but it never regained its previous level of operational functionality. The research that had been underway there was relocated, and new projects began at the Spectrum facility under stricter supervision. The attack had achieved its intended effect. Any foreign power contemplating threatening classified US facilities now had a clear reminder that this country would defend itself firmly if necessary. The Black Phantom mission had been completed. The history of US precision bombing technology had been rewritten in the skies over a remote area of the country. And during that 8-hour flight, Morrison and Chen had participated in an event that would change how US strategic defense was perceived in the years to come. The B-2 Spirit would remain the most advanced bomber ever built, a testament to American engineering's ability to produce unparalleled war machines.